What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Sunday, it's championship weekend. Let's talk about some quarterbacks and tight ends. Over the past few days, we've had some really interesting games that came with a lot of upside for fantasy players in them, and we'll look to continue that trend into this Sunday. Since there have already been a significant amount of players that have performed, this video may be a bit shorter than usual, but with 75% of the teams yet to take the field, there is still a lot of matchups to go over. One important factor heading into this Sunday and beyond is that a lot of the fantasy players that did already play have posted massive numbers. So a lot of you teams that are in the championship matchup, you may be having to play catch up, possibly valuing upside over safety at this point, and others of you that have compiled massive leads may want to lean on the side of safety. I'll be going over the quarterback and tight end matchups that I think could possibly bring you that upside or that floor you're looking for, and go over some players I think are coming in with additional risk or maybe don't have that ceiling you might possibly need. Before we do get into the video though, stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which quarterback currently leads the league in interceptable passes thrown. The correct answer was actually Matt Ryan. At the time of recording, nobody had yet guessed this question right, so we'll hop right into today's question. Which team is currently averaging the least amount of separation on their targets? Once again, which team in receiving is averaging the least amount of separation on their targets? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all of that out of the way, as per usual, we're hopping over to tight ends, and we're going to start with the polarizing player. Unfortunately for tight ends though, there really was only one player I would consider polarizing from the aspect that I think a lot of people may be misinterpreting the potential value and upside for this player this week, and that's going to be Noah Fant of the Denver Broncos. Don't get me wrong, I've been a big fan of Noah Fant at certain points of this season, and while yes, I have been at a recent low point for my expectations of Noah Fant, actually heading into last week's matchup, I had him as a premier start. He did pop off in last week's matchup, resulting in the highest amount of volume he'd received all season. 11 targets, 8 receptions, 68 yards and a touchdown. With his volume trending up to the high point of last week and his upcoming matchup being against the LA Chargers, a team that's definitely beatable by the tight end position who just got torched by Darren Waller last week, a lot of people are getting extremely excited for the potential of Noah Fant this week. The LA Chargers last week allowed Darren Waller on 12 targets to compile 9 receptions for over 150 receiving yards. He even scored a touchdown. My main concerns overall though have been the larger sample of the recent history of Noah Fant. We haven't really seen him hit those types of volume numbers, nor has he been actually finishing as a high-end tight end, but a lot of people really value him as that this week. With Darren Waller posting a massive week against his defense just a week ago, you better believe that the LA Chargers are going to be prepared for a tight end that just had a similar performance against a defense as well. If the LA Chargers were a team that was continuously beaten by that position, I would feel much more comfortable about the safety of Noah Fant potentially hitting that ceiling, but the way I see him this week isn't so much about his high-end upside, which he certainly brings to the table this week, but contrary to what most people believe, I see him more as a high-floor option. With that being said though, we do have more polarizing players in the quarterback section, but that's really going to do it for tight ends, so let's hop over to the TE starts. Up on your screen, you're going to see the top 12 tight ends, and you'll notice here I do have a list of some notable tight ends that have already played. As you can see, this does severely limit the total amount of tight ends that we have on the start and sit list available for the remainder of the week, because we have Darren Waller, TJ Hawkinson, Rob Gronkowski, George Kittle, as well as Jared Cook, who have already had their performances. Regardless though, each one of the tight ends here listed inside the top 12 have startability. Overall, I don't think you could go wrong with a lot of the options shown above, but we're going to start right at the top of the list with Travis Kelce. Usually, I don't highlight Travis Kelce because A, he's the number one tight end in all of fantasy, usually ranked in the number one spot each and every week. There's a potential chance that he even leads the league in receiving yards at the tight end position over wide receivers, which is insane, but I still couldn't leave him out of the starts this week because he has the best possible matchup we could ever ask for. For starters, the Atlanta Falcons rank in the top 5 at allowing fantasy points to tight ends. On top of that, this game has the second highest projected total of the week, with Kansas City having one of the highest projected team totals of the week, and with the added benefit of Clyde Edwards-Helaire not being available for this contest, potentially putting a kink in their run game, if Le'Veon Bell does have some struggles or that does lead to more passing production, Travis Kelce being one of the leading receivers on this team, not only between the 20s but also in the red zone, increased targets, increased volume is going to equate to fantasy points. The fantasy points per target against this Atlanta Falcons team is going to be much higher than it would be in other matchups. So with all of those factors combined, I couldn't help myself and added him to this list. I think a lot of you who maybe got in a hole in your matchups and have to come back from a large deficit, Travis Kelce is definitely a player you can look to help you get out of that hole. The next TE start we have is going to be Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. Logan Thomas quietly has went from waiver wire tight end to potential streaming option, and believe it or not, after a string of really solid performances over the last 4 weeks, Logan Thomas in PPR leagues is currently a top 5 tight end. Would you believe that? No, it's pretty hard to, but with Dwayne Haskins slated to be the starter for the Washington football team once again this week, Logan Thomas definitely has the tools to be able to continue this trend and put together another solid performance. Dwayne Haskins, while the starter, has provided Logan Thomas with a ton of volume, more volume than he has seen with any other quarterback starting. And while in the earlier parts of the season with Haskins at the helm, the quality of those targets was much lower, we saw him have an incredible connection with Logan Thomas in a difficult matchup last week. That type of showing makes me feel extremely confident in Logan Thomas's floor and potential ceiling in this matchup. This week, Logan Thomas faces the Carolina Panthers, which have allowed double-digit fantasy points to tight ends in each consecutive game over the past 9 weeks. They've allowed a touchdown to a tight end in the past 2 consecutive games as well. And with Terry McLaurin now listed as doubtful, unlikely to play, the potential volume and involvement for Logan Thomas could reach the same types of highs we saw last week. Moving into the final TE start, we have Austin Hooper of the Cleveland Browns. This one really couldn't be more simple. This week, the Cleveland Browns will be facing the New York Jets. The New York Jets on the season have been allowing the most fantasy points to the tight end position, and they've been a defense we've been targeting when finding starters off of the waiver wire all season long. Last week, we saw the New York Jets allow Tyler Higbee, a pretty dead fantasy player, post one of his best games of the entire season, but no, he wasn't the only one. 3 of the last 4 contests, Cleveland have allowed 20 plus fantasy points to tight ends. They've also allowed 7 receiving touchdowns to that position over the past 5 weeks, showing no ability to hold any team scoreless when targeting tight ends in the red zone. And with Austin Hooper coming off of his best performance of the season, with his 3rd most targets compiled on the year, the most receptions he's had in a single game, even catching 1 of his 3 touchdowns on the year, he'll look to continue his success against this defense that has been beaten all season long. Moving over to the tight end sits though, as I had mentioned earlier, I don't have major concerns with a lot of players listed inside of the top 12 above. Noah Fant I do have highlighted in yellow just because I do want to correctly set your expectations. We took care of that the earlier part of this video. So let's start with Jonnu Smith. We have him ranked as the TE9 of the remaining tight ends. This week he does have the benefit of playing Green Bay in a game that has the highest projected total of the week, a game in which the Tennessee Titans are going to be forced to continue to put up points for the entire game. And while yes, that's something that they've been doing all season long, they've been one of the better offenses over the last several weeks. Knowing that trend is going to continue in this matchup should make you feel a bit more comfortable in starting Jonnu Smith. With that being said though, this is not an ideal matchup for Jonnu Smith by any means. Jonnu Smith over the season has averaged the lowest target distance of any fantasy relevant tight end. A lot of his production has come in the area of the red zone, but when it comes to Green Bay, the matchup this week, it's an area the Packers have been very stingy when defending opposing tight ends. They've actually only allowed a tight end to score a receiving touchdown in just 2 games over the last 8 weeks. And with Jonnu Smith having questionable volume week by week, facing a tough defense combined with his low floor, it just brings a bit of concern for me this week when compared to the other players ranked around him. Behind him, we have Eric Ebron of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Eric Ebron was a tight end that had been trending in the right direction. He even had 2 games with double-digit targets in a row, then had a bust game, 2 receptions, 30 yards, and proceeded to follow that up with a game in which he had an early exit due to a back injury. That was of course last week. Heading into this week's matchup though, all the information we have does say that he's playing, so our big questions are, do we start him? Can we trust him? Eric Ebron has shown the involvement to be a starter, so if you do put him in, it's never going to be the worst start possible. But again, this is against the Indianapolis Colts, a defense that has held opposing tight ends to 40 yards or under more often than not, and while they have been beaten recently, allowing 8 receptions in each of the past 2 games, an average of over 100 receiving yards per game, that is very uncharacteristic for this defense. This game also has one of the lowest projected totals, and with the added risk of Eric Ebron potentially re-aggravating that back injury in this contest against this very physical defense, it's a matchup I would look to avoid if I had better options. Alright guys, we're moving over to our quarterback starts and sits, but before we do that, let's talk about some polarizing quarterbacks. What type of polarizing list would this be without adding Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles? Jalen Hurts is coming off of a phenomenal performance against the Arizona Cardinals, a defense typically stingy to opposing quarterbacks. Most owners of Jalen Hurts currently had a startable option before getting Jalen Hurts on their team, so there is a lot of questions on whether we can trust this young and experienced quarterback, or whether we should go for the quote-unquote safer option in the quarterback we also have on our roster or waiver wire. Me personally, I'm completely fine with trusting Jalen Hurts. I think the rushing floor that we've seen from him over the past few weeks, that makes us feel confident that even in a potential down game, a theoretical bust game for him, the floor for him, if he doesn't get it done in the passing game, is still going to be relatively high. In week 14, with his legs alone, he compiled over 12.3 fantasy points. The week before that, we saw 10.6, which is something very reminiscent to what we saw from Lamar Jackson in his first season starting. Any player posting that type of rushing floor is going to be nearly impossible to bust. They could have a very poor performance through the air and still post 16 to 18 points, a result unlikely to be the reason you lose. Once again though, I said that's more on the side of a worst case scenario though. We've already seen the type of upside he has through the air, so we have no problem ranking him inside the top 6 this week, ahead of many big names, including players that have helped you get to the championship game. Moving over to the quarterback starts though, we have Jalen Hurts, of course, who I had just mentioned. You'll also see at the top of the list, I have Patrick Mahomes, and that's in combination for what I mentioned with Travis Kelce earlier. This game has one of the highest projected totals, Kansas City coming in with one of the highest projected team totals, and a questionable backfield heading into this matchup. No need to dive too much more in depth with Patrick Mahomes. We know what we're really going to get from him, but if you're one of those teams crawling your way back from a major deficit and still have Patrick Mahomes, the type of upside he brings can help you crawl out of almost any hole. I think the same thing can be said with a player like Aaron Rodgers coming in at the QB3. There are very few games that are even on this slate that have 2 offensive powerhouses going head to head, and that's something we're seeing with Green Bay versus Tennessee. While not every game script and game flow does go as planned, this does have the highest projected total, meaning both teams should be forced to push the ball downfield for the entire contest, and with Aaron Rodgers playing on an MVP caliber level, if he's forced into that type of situation this week against one of the league's worst passing defenses, there is going to be a ton of upside with Aaron Rodgers, who does have some sneaky potential with his legs. The next solid QB start for some of you waiver wire streamers out there is going to be Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield draws the 3rd best possible matchup we could ask for, one that comes with a lot of safety and upside, especially when you see what opposing quarterbacks have been able to do against this defense over the recent sample. The New York Jets have allowed a multi-passing TD performance to opposing quarterbacks in each of the past 5 contests. We've also seen an extremely high ceiling from a passing perspective in 2 games recently. In week 8, they allowed 5 passing touchdowns, and just 2 weeks ago, week 14, 4 passing touchdowns, a similar type of upside that we've seen Baker bring to the table on separate occasions this season as well. In week 7 against Cincinnati, he threw for 5 passing touchdowns. Just 3 weeks ago against a similarly bad passing defense of the Tennessee Titans, he threw for 4 passing touchdowns and hasn't scored less than 20 fantasy points for any game over the past 3 weeks. My only concern, of course, would be the potential lead that the Cleveland Browns could have late in this game, and with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, 2 very capable running backs, that could limit the overall passing volume we see from Mayfield, but that's still not enough to concern me because this is one of the best matchups we could ask for. The final QB start we have is Mitchell Trubisky of the Chicago Bears, and this is definitely one for more of you bargain bin shoppers. I talked a bit about floor and ceiling and exactly how important that can be depending on your opponent and your matchup. Some of you who may have massive leads may veer on the side of safety, while others may need a ton of upside. And while hitting that upside is not something I think Mitchell Trubisky has a high chance of, I do think he comes in with a sneaky solid floor for this upcoming matchup against Jacksonville. Over the past 8 games, Jacksonville has not been able to hold any quarterback under 2 passing touchdowns. There has been no game so far this season that Jacksonville has held a quarterback scoreless through the air. So when it comes to safety, the Jacksonville Jaguars are actually the team that you want to target. That's not to say that this matchup doesn't come with upside either. 8 games so far this season, they've allowed quarterbacks to post 20 plus points against them. So while the upside certainly is there, when it comes to Trubisky and what I see him as this week, I see him more for the safety in his floor. Alright guys, we're moving over to the quarterback sits, and as you can see, there aren't a ton of players that I'm not really liking the matchup for. Russell Wilson, of course, is going to be one of those players who has that top end upside that comes in with a really bad matchup. That still may not be enough of a reason to leave him on the bench this week. Russell Wilson is the type of quarterback to get it done regardless of any matchup, this being divisional as well. Usually in those types of games, things don't shake up exactly as we see them, so the LA Rams could come into this matchup and underperform. But if we're going off of the trend across the season and the recent sample that we've seen from Russell Wilson, there are going to be some red flags. Russell Wilson has been unable to eclipse 15.1 fantasy points in 4 of his last 6 games. Meaning if you started him over the last 6 game sample, the results that you've seen have been more disappointing than not. His latest performance against Washington, a similarly strong defense, he only threw for 1 touchdown, and while the work he gets done with his legs did account for some fantasy points, adding in his interception, his 12 fantasy point total is something similar to what we could see this week. The LA Rams across the season have allowed the fewest fantasy points to the position. The last time that these two teams faced, they held Wilson to under 10 fantasy points and have not allowed a 20 plus point fantasy day to any quarterback since week 6. Moving into the final 2 quarterback sits that we have, we can kind of combine them together because this is 2 quarterbacks that are pretty similar when it comes to matchup that are actually in the same game. This is of course Phillip Rivers and Ben Roethlisberger. These are 2 quarterbacks that don't get any production done with their legs. When it comes to those types of quarterbacks, the floor for them week over week is inherently going to be lower, and you can double that when you consider that this is going to be the matchup with the second lowest projected total of the week. The lowest projected total of the week is Carolina versus Washington. That just goes to show you exactly how low we're talking about, and with a lot of teams, as I had mentioned earlier, either targeting that upside to chase a deficit that they're crawling out of, or teams that may come in with a massive lead. Depending on that type of situation, you're going to be seeking players with a high ceiling, or for safety, seeking players with a low floor. Considering the low projected total and the strengths of each of these opposing defenses, that being Pittsburgh and Indianapolis, the floor for each quarterback with no rushing upside, it's going to be low, and with the total projected to be as low as it is, the upside we could look for to combat some of that lack of floor, it's really just not there either. So if we're looking at these quarterbacks, not targeting them for the safety in their floor or the upside in their ceilings, it's really difficult to see exactly how they fit in when there are so many other options you could potentially find on the waiver wire that may have less name value but have a lot stronger chance for success this week. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. Good luck this week in the championship matchup. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.